Today on the show, I'm chatting with Robbie Moon from the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business, and we thank them for all their support this season. Robbie and I explore some of his efforts using natural language processing for finance. While stock ticker data makes a nice numeric time stream that numeric approaches can easily be used on, there are volumes of text written about companies in their disclosures and elsewhere that can serve as a ripe data set to help predict the market. In addition to work on unstructured data, we explore Robbie's course, which you can take. All that and more coming right up.
My name is Robbie Moon. I'm an associate professor at Georgia Tech in the Scheller College of Business. In addition to that, I serve as our faculty director for our online business analytics certificate. Been at Scheller for finishing up 6 years now, and over that time, I've taught a variety of classes, everything from introductory accounting to undergraduates. I developed a data analytics class, which we can talk about later if you want. I also have taught our MBAs, and then I'm in the process of developing a new class on sustainability reporting. So a lot of different things going on here, but I do have a couple classes in analytics that I've taught here.
Are there specific research areas? Obviously the ones you've taught are part of it, but how would you summarize your sort of academic focus?
When you hear you're a research faculty in accounting, someone will say, well, there's not much research to do in debits and credits. And there's a little bit to do, honestly, but that's not the kind of stuff I do. So I do a lot of work. Like accounting really is information, right? And so we look at how various types of information relate to different market-related outcomes, whether it be, trading decisions or, what firms report as earnings. And then we'll look at, various firm disclosures, whether it's their financial statements or some of their narrative disclosures that might accompany, earnings each quarter, conference calls, stuff like that. And then kind of lastly, more recently, I've done some work in social media. And so kind of the intersection between capital markets and social media platforms that you've heard of, like X now, I guess, formerly Twitter, stuff like StockTwits. And then I've also done quite a bit of work with this investing platform, Seeking Alpha, which is maybe not the traditional type of what most would think of as social media. But from our purposes, we kind of view it as crowdsourced. And, there's definitely a conversation that goes on around the analysis that the contributors do. And so I've done a good bit of research with that as well.
And what sort of data do you acquire or have to get or, use in the general research you're working on?
Well, it really depends on the question. So, I think there's some basic financial statement, stock return data. We have, huge databases that we can access for that. The University of Chicago runs something called CRISP, which is kind of securities prices. S&P puts together this CompuStat data, which is all the financial statement data that we use in our research. But a lot of the stuff I do kind of pulls in, more unique data or what I would call non-standard data. And so like speaking of Seeking Alpha, years ago, I got permission to kind of scrape articles from their website. And so this was just raw text content that we've then gone on and analyzed. Done similar things with conference calls. Twitter used to be free for academic use. And so it collected a large amount of data for Twitter. And again, doing various kinds of textual analysis on those, whether it's kind of just simple sentiment analysis based on dictionaries or more advanced machine learning exercises with different classifiers and so forth.
What are some of the challenges in working with data that isn't as clean as stock data?
Because it's not as clean, the quality of the cleaning process can really impact what you can do with it. In research I remember my PhD program, we talked about a lot of times we face this, what we call like a joint hypothesis problem, where we use like a simple linear regression to test an association where Y is some outcome we're interested in. And then X is some construct or variable that we think captures something interesting. Well, our prediction or our hypothesis is kind of predicated on whatever that variable is, that X variable actually capturing what we think it's capturing. And so when we're dealing with noisier data like this, I think that becomes a bigger issue. I mean, on the one hand, it could just be very noisy. And if it's very noisy, then it's going to reduce the chance that you kind of observe the effect that you think you should. But that's only if it's random noise, right? If it's non-random, then you can kind of get some spurious results that you think are driven by reason A, but are really driven by the challenges with cleaning that data.
Well, the idea of having text is very interesting. It seems like there's a lot of potential there, but yet it's not at all numeric. What do you do with raw text in these situations?
There's a lot of different techniques that we'll use. anyone that's had some experience with natural language processing knows kind of the most basic form is really just looking at kind of word counts, what kind of words are appearing and how frequently are those occurring. In our research, there was a pair of researchers that developed several different dictionaries that are meant to measure aspects of financial text. This can be things like, uncertainty, or the most common one would be tone, right? So is the text positive or is the text negative? And in my work or in my setting, how you might convey positive news and negative news is very different than, how someone might convey it when they're expressing opinions about a movie or a book or something like that. And so that's kind of necessitated the need for these special dictionaries. So I've done, work with kind of that most basic approach. So that's one representation, just kind of what we think of as like a bag of words. Obviously everyone knows about ChatGPT, and before ChatGPT, there were other methods of vectorizing text, right? So rather than representing each word as kind of its own unique thing, recognize that there's interrelations or similarities among words. And so there's various techniques you can use to convert documents or convert words into some vector space, right? And you can kind of decide what the dimensions of that data will be. And in my experience, at least, that typically works a little bit better because it recognizes that certain words mean similar things and certain words mean very different. Whereas when you take a very strict kind of bag of words approach, you're considering, each individual word pretty independent. Lastly, kind of getting beyond just representation, we will use different models to try to classify information. Going back to Seeking Alpha, I have an ongoing project where we tried to identify, do articles discuss kind of financial performance or accounting related topics? And so we kind of built a model, a supervised learning model that we trained to predict whether that type of topic was there. And so the data that we used in our research was simply did the model detect this type of language or did it not? And so there's really a variety of approaches you can take. It kind of just depends on ultimately what you're trying to measure.
Do you find that there's any banana peels to slip on? I'm thinking specifically of the word not, saying we met financial projections or we did not meet financial projections, differ by only one word, but have opposite polarity.
I think that's most concerning with kind of a simple bag of words approach where you ignore order, you ignore context. If you don't, we call it negation, right? If you don't take care to look for those negating words, then you can invert that. Now, one thing that the researchers will do, and actually I've even mentioned this to my students when we've talked about measuring tone, if you kind of think positive tone and negative tone have equal weight, then one thing you can do is just ignore positive tone. Just say, I'm pretty confident I can measure negative tone well, because people don't negate negative tone, right? And so, or at least they shouldn't. It does simplify things. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think understanding how language works is a first step before you can start conducting these analyses.
When I think of financial disclosures and things like that, I don't think of them as having a tremendous amount of sentiment, the way maybe a social media post would. In fact, someone showed me a eviction letter that one could say has positive sentiment to it. And I think you'd hinted at this earlier, saying that financial disclosures, you kind of have to train your own data set. Could you explore some of the challenges around how you leverage financial sentiment and measure accurately in that setting?
So I guess two things. There's different sources. And so if you think about financial disclosures like an earnings press release, right? So companies will often include a couple of 2 or 3 paragraphs, maybe more, about, what earnings were relative to kind of market expectations. And those tend to be there's some sentiment there. Like, they'll say we beat expectations by X%, but it's not over the top. And it is very kind of measured language. And so the models can pick that up. But, we also have to recognize that it's not if you think about the possible scale of polarity from -1 to +1, we're dealing with things that are very close to zero, right? -5% to +5%. That's maybe one limitation, but also something that's not that surprising. Where I think you'll see a little bit more expressive language is in, maybe in conference calls, you see a little bit more, particularly if you get to Q&A, like where they are answering questions. It's still not over the top. Most executives, with few exceptions, are pretty reserved with what they're willing to say. But you're going to get a little bit more free-flowing discussion. And so you might pick up more there. And then, again, a lot of the work I'm looking at, I'll look at the conversation around firm disclosures. And so, earnings come out, management forecast comes out. I'll then look at how do investors or social media users talk about these? And then we're in social media. And so tone can become much more extreme, as I think anyone that's paid attention to like the GameStop ups and downs over the last several years and seen examples of the language around there. I mean, GameStop's not the only firm that you'll see social media users using strong language about. And so, you almost have the opposite problem. Like something very, very extreme is probably not meant to be that extreme. It's just the vernacular that's used.
When talking specifically about conference calls, I think of those as an audio file. How do you get from that very raw data into what you're going to look at?
Well, fortunately for me, others put the transcripts together. So I did actually try to do some work with audio files at one point where we were trying to get exactly the timing of when things were said. But for the most part, the research that I'm doing is kind of taking the transcript that's published, usually by a third party, and analyzing that. And the reason those come out, the reason transcripts are so popular, without researchers needing them, is because it is a form of firm disclosure. And so if you miss the conference call, the quickest way to see what was said is obviously to read through it rather than trying to sit down and listen to the whole thing. So yeah, fortunate there that I can kind of rely on this pre-prepared document, which is also really nice because unlike some of the disclosures you mentioned, which can be very messy in terms of, the HTML encoding can be a mess. You'll get tables in the middle of text and things like that. Conference call transcripts tend to be very structured, right? And so you'll see, speaker A made this statement, speaker B made this statement. And so you can do some pretty powerful analysis looking at, who said what kind of analysts were called on and things like that.
Do hedge funds or some person like that then directly trade on financial sentiment, or is it maybe a signal? How does it get utilized?
Yeah, that's the question that I think everyone wants to know the answer to. I think the answer is probably, they have lots of different signals that they consider. One question actually that a PhD student has been talking to me about an idea trying to figure this out is, are hedge funds trading on information that managers disclose? Almost certainly, right? They're going to look at what was said. They're going to compare it to quantitative information and update models and come up with something that suggests either over or undervaluation. What's a little bit harder to tell is if there's kind of immediate, almost algorithmic trading based on, textual disclosures. And one reason for that, I think, is like you said, there's just so much noise in these. I did have a paper I published a few years ago that was trying to get at this very question. We found some evidence that suggested there was some immediate changes or shifts following disclosure that we could tie to maybe not the text exactly, but kind of properties of the document that would make things more or less scrapable or processable. But I think that's still an open question. Now, this isn't exactly what you asked about, but there is a paper that came out relatively recently. So I mentioned earlier about this kind of financial sentiment dictionary that's become very popular in research. I think it's also become somewhat popular among professional investors. There's a paper that came out and showed since the publication of that dictionary, there appears to be a shift in how companies will talk about talk about performance. And so that also complicates things, right? If the corpus or the document you're using to measure tone all of a sudden influences what managers are willing to say, it becomes less usable for that purpose. But it's all suggestive. I don't know that we really have strong direct evidence that someone's altering that, but we do have some suggestive evidence.
Well, I think it's Goodhart's law that says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So
that's exactly right.
Always new challenges. Mm-hmm. Is this the domain of, high-end quants on Wall Street, or can a casual day trader get their hands dirty in some Python or some R code and find a signal there?
I think the techniques are out there available for anyone. I would never advocate someone try to become a day trader and trade on textual information. I know I don't. I do a lot of research in it, but my investing is pretty vanilla, pretty boring, just investing in in funds. I think that the techniques are pretty tractable for those with some computer background, some analytics background. Obviously, when we think about who can react fastest to signals, the big traders have everyone beat. They're reacting to information, maybe not directly, but at least based on order flows and stuff, following a disclosure within milliseconds. And so where there may be opportunity is if you kind of come up with some kind of fundamental strategy that identifies where managers are conveying information that is somehow underpriced, and then you can kind of take a long view, more fundamental approach. But popping in and out of stocks, to me, that would be pretty hard to do at least with the techniques that kind of I know how to do.
Well, could you share an overview of the syllabus, what students learn in your course Analysis of Unstructured Data?
This analysis for unstructured data course was developed for our business analytics certificate. And so it's a class that's only been taught online. And what it does is, a lot of our students are coming in with little to no experience in coding and Python, which is what I use in my class, in analytics, and often even, and the class isn't necessarily about financial disclosures, but given my background, we spend some time in that space as well. And so really, we start off with kind of the basics of like you started here, how would you start to measure information in text? And so we look at, how do we break text up into words? What do these mean? What are some challenges? We'll implement that, and then we'll do some kind of basic analyses where we see what kinds of words correlate with. I was actually looking, before we chatted today, I was looking through some of the assignments, and one thing I have them do is look at patent applications, and then there's kind of these measures of patent value that are out there that academics have put together, and we'll see what kinds of words and phrases tend to correlate with something that ends up being a higher value. And so just kind of this exercise where you can see the type of language that doesn't necessarily cause an increase in firm value, but reflects some kind of intellectual property that eventually does have value attached to it. We spend 3 or 4, this is a 7-week class. And so we spend the first half of the class just on that, really just getting our hands dirty in some data, cleaning it up, structuring it, getting some basic summary statistics. And then the last several weeks of the class, we move more into analytics, a lot of machine learning based stuff. So we'll look at some unstructured methods. So topic modeling, right? We'll look at how we can extract or model the topics that are discussed, in a corpus or in a set of documents. We'll look at some cluster analysis. We'll look at, I mentioned vectorization earlier. We'll look at how we can use Word2Vec, which was kind of the first mainstream vectorization approach, and we'll apply that to some data. And then I finish up with classifiers, right? With kind of more traditional classifiers and how we might adapt those for text problems. We finish up with a little bit of discussion of transformers, which is obviously the architecture that kind of underlies, ChatGPT and other large language models. We don't do anything specifically with ChatGPT yet. Maybe eventually it'll be incorporated into the course, but we do look at transformers in general, BERT models, and see how we can fine tune those for different purposes.
Well, it's been quite a journey from bag of words through Word2Vec and BERT, and now some of these LLMs. How have you observed that the evolution of the way people approach translation and analysis of unstructured data? How has that changed over the years?
I think computationally, it's gotten more complex, obviously. But in some ways, I think a lot of these techniques kind of make things a little bit easier and a little bit more reliable from my perspective. Kind of going back to the point you raised earlier about negation, right? When you have words like not. If you're using a dictionary-based approach and you're not careful, those kinds of things can create issues. But if you're willing to take the time to fine-tune a BERT model to measure financial sentiment, that model is going to totally understand the context that is changed when you use a word like not. And so in some ways, I think it takes some of these decisions or issues, it makes it easier to deal with them, because the model is kind of, by considering the full context of what's being said, it's going to kind of automatically take those into consideration. So I'm excited. I think, from both a research perspective and, a student that's interested in analytics perspective, it really opens the doors for a lot of advanced techniques. As an example, there's a paper that's right now, that's kind of circulating as a working paper right now, that looks at, take these earnings, like we talked about earnings announcements and how you might have text associated with an earnings announcement. And it asks ChatGPT to summarize this. And what it shows is the summary that's produced by ChatGPT is a better predictor of the reaction than the original disclosure was. And so stuff like that's really cool to me, that it just kind of says that these tools are going to allow everyone to process and understand information a lot faster. So from a research perspective, it gives me a great tool that I can use. But from a user perspective, I think it shows a lot of promise as well.
What's an appropriate background for someone thinking about taking your course?
I think I can probably speak more to the program than my class, because We're really open to anyone. We've had people that have, been teachers or educators all the way to, those working as data scientists right now. We're open to considering anyone. I think, the main thing that we look for is either some technical proficiency in terms of quant skills. Did you do well in math, in your undergraduate degree? Or do you have work experience in related fields? If you don't, that's okay. But we'll say, look, there are aspects of this program that are pretty technical. And so here's some materials that we definitely encourage you to brush up on. You don't have any classes in like linear algebra or calculus, for example. We're not going to, have you solving complex integrals or doing matrix multiplication, but understanding what those things are definitely helps when you talk about things like machine learning models and how gradient descent works and things like that. From a coding perspective, students come into I assume they have no experience. And so I actually spend the first demonstration in my class is really just going through the basics of Python. Like, here's how you define variables. Here's how you might, write a basic for loop and things like that. Now, it very quickly moves into actually analyzing textual data, but we do start with the beginning. And I think the other classes are very similar. So they use different tools, and they're always going to start with the basics of those tools.
Could you overview some of those other courses and how they complement yours?
The certificate is made up of 4 courses. I think the title is Business Analytics for Managers. And so it's really a class that talks about the intersection of analytics and management of different aspects of a business. And there's quite a bit of demonstrations and technical work, but a lot of it's about understanding the analytics process, right? How you might move from raw data to information and what kind of decisions that information can inform. We have a class, machine learning. I think that's called Machine Learning for Business. And so I think the title is obvious what it does. And so it'll really go through various unsupervised and supervised techniques. I think more with quantitative data, kind of talk about business applications for those and where you need to be cognizant of one model working better than another and how you might go about fine-tuning some of these models and so forth. And then we have a third class on visualization. And so it's a class about best practices in visualizing the results of analysis, which I think is hugely important because a lot of times analysts at companies, they may be expert programmers, they may be experts in the techniques they're doing, but eventually they have to convey the information that they get from their analysis to someone who's not as proficient. And so I think visualizations are a great way to do that. And the instructor there breaks it into kind of a data exploration type of visualization. So what kind of visuals can help you understand the data before you really dive into analyzing it, as well as things like dashboards and presentations for, okay, now the analysis is done. What's the best way to package these results for someone else to understand? Lastly, like we've been talking about, my class is the analysis of unstructured data. And so mine's the one that focused most on textual data, and really that's all we look at. So I think it's a pretty well-rounded set of courses that covers the basis of the tools that someone interested in business analytics would want to cover.
And do you have a sense of what graduates typically go on to do next?
So the program's still relatively new. And so I think this is the question that students often ask. And, we've really only graduated the first couple cohorts. We definitely have students that are in data analysis roles, data scientist or, analytics roles. And then we have others that have kind of brought the tools back to colleagues and kind of said, hey, learned about this. Do you think it works here? And then maybe they're not the ones that actually sits down and codes it all up, but they were able to kind of connect what they learned in class to something that they're doing. I guess the takeaway is we've had people that go very technical with it, and we've had people that have kind of used it to grow in the role that they're currently in.
Could you share some details on the program in general, the time commitments and things like that?
Sure, yeah. So the program, as we've said, it's 4 classes. Students take 1 class at a time. It's a 4 credit certificate. And so students are earning graduate credit. If you complete the full certificate, you have 12 credit hours. The way the classes are set up is they're over 7-week periods. In a typical fall semester, you would take, 2 classes. You just wouldn't take them at the same time. You'd take them sequentially. So because of that, it is fairly compressed. If you think, for those that were in college not too long ago, you can kind of think of your traditional, 3-hour class that meets 3 times a week, and then, 3 times a week for maybe an hour, hour and a half. And then away from class most of the time, you kind of expect to spend at least that much time, if not a couple more hours. And so with the compressed 7-week format, it's double, right? So you're going to have anywhere from 3 to 5, maybe 6 hours on the high end of video related content. So lectures. For me, I have lectures and demonstrations. And then probably about that amount of time outside of that material, maybe a little bit more studying, working on assignments, taking quizzes, things like that. So it's not a light load, but everyone that's in our program so far, with maybe a couple exceptions, has been working full time, and so they find a way to get the stuff done at night or on the weekends, and it's all online and asynchronous, which means you work at your own pace. In fact, the only live interaction is office hours that are held once a week, and those are completely optional. And if you can't make it, they're recorded, so you can kind of get caught up there as well. But yeah, it's I think it's a lot of material in a relatively short amount of time, but so far at least the format has worked pretty well for those that are working full time.
And what's the process and sign up like?
Basically, you're applying to the graduate program at Georgia Tech, and so the process is the same as if you were applying to an online master's degree, for example. And so that information is all on the website. Basically, you'll go fill out an application. We don't require any test scores. And so many programs, many, especially master's programs do, but for the certificate, we don't have any test scores. We just basically ask for a personal statement, why you want to do this, where you see yourself going in your career, what kind of professional experience you have, academic experience. Georgia Tech requires transcripts. We'll kind of use that as a basis for, how did you do in your math classes and things like that. But there's plenty of students that have been admitted doing poorly in math, but, showing proficiency afterwards. And so I tell students, you have to submit your transcripts, but don't think it's ever going to be something that automatically excludes you. And then we'll ask for some letters of recommendation as well. And so I think we require 2. Sometimes recommenders don't follow through. That's okay, as long as we get at least 1 that comes through. We're comfortable moving ahead.
And in terms of the next sign up for the next cohort, are there any deadlines we can share?
Sure. So we just finished our fall 2024 application cycle. Happy to say looks like we have the biggest cohort yet, so the program's definitely growing. The next opportunity to enroll will be for the spring of 2025, and the application deadline there is going to be October 1st. But yeah, if you check the website out, you'll see a calendar of some information sessions and some other opportunities to learn more about the program. And one nice thing, I didn't mention this before, but there are application fees anytime you apply to graduate programs. If you attend any of these information sessions, we go ahead and waive that application fee. So it's definitely worthwhile for someone that's interested in applying.
We'll have some links in the show notes for listeners who want to follow up. Robbie, where can listeners follow you online?
I'm on LinkedIn. Happy for anyone to connect to me there. And then, if you have questions about the program, feel free to reach out. I think my contact information is on the website. I do have a Twitter account, but or an X account, but I'm not super active there. So probably not worth the follow. But definitely feel free to reach out through either LinkedIn or directly via email. And I'm happy to connect and chat.
Robbie, thanks you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kyle. I enjoyed it.